This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to our forum on prevailing in the pursuit of happiness. It's a privilege to have all of you here on such a beautiful day. I appreciate your taking the time to be with us. My name is John Whitty. I serve as director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, the host of today's forum. Our center is devoted to exploring some of the religious foundations and dimensions of law, politics, and society. For the past 4 years, our center has had the privilege of leading a major research project on the pursuit of happiness in interdisciplinary perspective. Drawing on a score of scholars and 12 fields of study, we have tried to unpack the iconic phrase life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the meanings and measurements of happiness, the conditions and contexts that can aid or obstruct its pursuit, the manners and methods of pursuing it responsibly within various communities and professions, not least the profession of law. Today we begin a year-long series of public forums designed to draw all of you into the vibrant interdisciplinary conversation we have enjoyed with our senior fellows studying the pursuit of happiness. We want to plumb with you the wisdom about happiness and blessedness and flourishing in various ancient philosophical, cultural, and religious traditions around the world. We want to tour together the laboratories and clinics that are probing the neural, biological, and social forms and foundations of happiness. We want to try to build bridges of knowledge across these many specialists who are exploring happiness, and to build channels of information to make all of this specialized lore practical and accessible to all of you. And we want to hear from you about what makes you happy and blessed, resilient and resolved, joyful and hopeful, comfortable and confirmed in your life, in your work, in your relationships, in your family, in your chosen vocation. And to that end, we want to start with a couple of snippets that we have taken interviews of you in the hallways. And we've done this with our great Dean of Media, Corky Gallo, under the direction of the director of our project today, Public Relations Director of our center, April Bogle. So we're going to see you on the film for a little bit, and then we're going to introduce our two great speakers who will be leading us in a more serious conversation about prevailing in the pursuit of happiness. Let's watch you on film.
You know, getting an extra couple hours of sleep, you know, finding out I'm a day ahead in the readings. It's the simple things, the small victories that you have to cherish.
Knowing that I have a future makes me happy.
It's a very difficult question. I would actually have to be happy first. I'm not desperately unhappy, so it's okay.
Playing with my daughter makes me happy. She's 15 months old. I love it.
My friends? I don't know. I'm not really happy all the time.
I am really happy in this community, just being surrounded by good people. I'm stimulated by the work and, you know, and the people. So that's what makes me happy here at Emory.
I'm very happy when I get a manicure and a pedicure, when my hair's done, and when I have on a cute outfit.
I am very happy when I'm in tip-top condition and when I strictly follow my diet. Thanks.
Well, actually, I pursue happiness by being a pessimist, which is I'm never, ever disappointed, and I'm usually pleasantly surprised. So actually, I'm happy most of the day because everything always goes better than I thought it would have.
It's a very difficult question. If I had a life plan, it'd be easier for me to answer.
Drinking green tea. Right now, I mean, after hours, it's prostitution and drugs.
I plan on pursuing happiness by surrounding myself with the people I care about and the people who care about me. And that's more important to me than what I'm actually doing.
I am happy, like all the time.
I'm good. How do I look?
Who's seeing this?
I'm very interested in child advocacy as a future career, and so far here at Emory there's a lot of opportunities in that field that make me happy, and I also feel make the people I work with very happy.
Just letting people know that I'm there for them and hope that they'll be there for me, and that's really, I guess, the most rewarding thing. I also go shopping a lot. a lot. But that has to stop because I have no job. Surprise.
I want to be able to afford myself a certain lifestyle where I don't have to worry about finances as much, and I'm just able to pursue more artistic things like make music and paint and draw and eat snacks.
But I do like shopping. I'm a good bargain shopper. Instant gratification. Don't let my dad see that.
Right now, I'm doing what makes me happy. I'm going to a lot of music shows. I'm interested in my property class because I want to follow career in entertainment law. So I'm trying to balance law school with sports, with music, with exploring the city of Atlanta that's got a lot to offer.
By trying to achieve some balance between law school and the rest of my life, which is not easy, but I think it's important.
Right now, my lunch that is right out of sight makes me very happy.
Just follow the dreams, because one of the benefits of the economic situation now is that, everything's up for grabs. So you can start from zero, and there's no harm in not following the high-paying job at the beginning, but doing what makes you satisfied as an individual.
Trying to be the best daughter, friend, sister, whatever that I can be. And honestly, just probably a lot of shopping. I mean, there will be houses in the future to decorate, new clothes, new suits.
By the way, a good way to stay healthy and happy is to buy carrots that look like potato chips.
I think we have some budding Hollywood careers. In case the law business doesn't work out, I think you folk will be fine. It's a special privilege to welcome two distinguished Emory colleagues who will lead us in a more serious conversation now about prevailing in the pursuit of happiness. Both of these have been leaders in the sciences that they occupy. Both are senior fellows in our center. Both are writing major studies as part of their work in our Pursuit of Happiness project, and both are world-class individuals as well. We begin with Professor Ed Craighead, who holds the J. Rex Fuqua Chair in Psychology at Emory and serves as director of the Child and Adolescent Mood Disorders program on the campus. Before coming to Emory, Professor Craighead held distinguished professorships and directorships and chair appointments at Penn State University, University of Colorado, and Duke Medical School. He has published 10 books and 160-plus articles on various psychosocial aspects, prevention, and treatments of major depression and bipolar disorders, of which he is a ranking expert in the world. Professor Craighead is editor of the leading journal Clinical Psychology, Science and Practice, and has been editor of a half-dozen other specialty journals in his fields. He has served as president of the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, president of the Society of Scientific Clinical Psychology, and president of the prestigious clinical division of the American Psychological Association. He is now a fellow in each of these organizations, and he's recently won the coveted APA Helperin Award, which now crowds his shelf and wall with the many other prizes and citations and awards and trophies he has won for his sterling work. It's been a great privilege to have him as a senior fellow in our center, to learn from his wisdom and from his scientific ken, and to have the privilege of welcoming him to this lectern today. After Professor Craighead, we will hear from another distinguished colleague, Professor of Sociology, Corey Keyes, who has come to us from the University of Wisconsin recently. He has published some 70 articles and a half-dozen books, including blockbuster titles co-authored, one called Flourishing, Positive Psychology and a Life Well Lived, Risk and Resilience in Human Development, and with our colleague Cheryl Goodman, Women and Depression, a handbook for the social, behavioral, and biomedical sciences. Professor Keyes is one of the leading scholars in the world in the burgeoning science of positive psychology, and it's a privilege to have worked with him in the course of this same project and to have the opportunity to learn from him in the course of the project and in his presentation today. Each of these distinguished colleagues will offer us 20 to 25 minutes of reflections based in part and drawing together in part some of the empirical studies that they have engaged in with you. And after they have had their presentations and a little opportunity for tete-a-tete together, we will open the floor for a conversation with you, which will continue till 6 o'clock when we will open up the bar and you will have an opportunity for some serious conversation. So let's begin with a wonderful presentation by our colleague and friend, Professor Craighead. Craighead.
Thank you very much, John. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to express my gratitude to you on such a fine afternoon for coming in and listening. If I weren't speaking, I might have passed on the opportunity myself, so I really appreciate your being here. I have recently, or in the last year, have given 2 lectures to lawyers in Atlanta, a group that I'm very impressed with, the Volunteer Lawyers of Atlanta, and they've been an incredibly pleasant group with whom to work, so I hope that we can replicate that experience today. I have to begin, of course, with since I'm from the medical school as well as psychology, with my disclosure, including the fact that I'm not quite sure how it could ever be of great value, but the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, and the other things that I do. And sorry, but it has to be there long enough for you to read it. Since you're lawyers, I want to make sure you read it. What I'm about to say is actually represents one view or one take that I can explain in 20 minutes about happiness. As John has pointed out, we've discussed this from an historical, philosophical, sociological, psychological perspective. We've beat it up and down and sideways. And out of all of those discussions, I'm going to talk about one particular viewpoint, and obviously that's the one that I believe most strongly might be of some practical utility. When we were asked to prepare this, we were asked to give it some substance, not just to be 5 steps to happiness. And so I'm going to actually talk more about a model that you can wind up using in different kinds of contexts, both to cope with depressive or anxious states, but also to sort of move yourself in a more positive direction. But I want to be clear that I'm talking about it from my own perspective. And so to illustrate that, there's the next slide. I'll ask you what you see. Look at it a second. How many of you see a young man with spectacles? How many of you see the word liar? Okay, that's interesting. Defensive response. Usually more people see liars. But that was a joke. Come on. If you can laugh about carrots and potato chips, you can laugh about that. All right. So what I'm talking about, I think, has fairly serious implications. Namely, if you look at what happens with depression, and I could put up slides from all over the world. This one happens to be from Australia in a large community study. The rate of depression stays around 1 or 2%, and there are no gender differences until about 15. During high school, there's a rapid upturn. The red line is across boys and girls, men and women. The yellow line is for women. The blue line is for men. And what you see is that by the age of 18, actually, it's pretty much beginning to level off. It's leveled off by age 21. And there obviously are a few new episodes. After that, the vast majority of the depressions are recurrences. And there is no difference in gender in recurrences. But this double the rate or twice the rate of depression among women versus men, and the same thing holds true for anxiety disorders, pursues across the lifetime, because that's established actually pretty much by the time you finish high school. And frequently we talk about that and what we do in college. Well, why would I mention that today? Well, first of all, in the Carnegie report, the emphasis on getting practical experience, this is the educating of lawyers, is mentioned, but there's also embedded in that a discussion of the whole person. The other reason to mention that is because there are good data summarized in a paper, if you want to look at it, from Australia by Kath Hall, which suggests that lawyers have, even if you take the conservative approach, almost twice the rate of mood disorders and anxiety that other professionals have, including medical school, graduate school, business school, and other professional schools. Some people suggest it's more than twice as high in some of the studies, but if we take a conservative approach, it's twice as high. What that suggests to me, of course, is a fairly high level of unhappiness if you take the flip-flop of the depression and anxiety, but it also suggests that there's a lot of stress, which probably comes as a big surprise to you. So I want to talk about one model by which we can sort of deal with explaining not only how this comes about, but what you might be able to do about it. This is cognitive model, and I could be here and I could make the argument as a neurobiology person that we should focus on the biology. As a behaviorist, I could say we focus on the behavior. But I think the model that has shown the greatest utility in dealing with stress and in moving from being unhappy to happy, from being anxious to non-anxious, is the cognitive model. And we'll start over here. There's some life event. Obviously, this goes in a circle and comes back around, but for illustration purposes, there's some life event. For example, you flunk an exam, or say you meet someone socially and you get rejected by that person. That triggers an automatic thought. We'll come back to this in a minute. And following that, you then go into some mood state, which can be on some dimension of happy, sad, and you're likely to engage in some behavior. That then, of course, feeds back around to become another life event. The main thing I'm going to focus on today is this column, because that's where we know that you can do something. Both we know that it contributes to these, but we also know these are where you can make changes. And it's related, I think we'll have a segue into what Corey is going to talk about next. So in addition to this sort of horizontal model, which if we stopped here would be sort of warmed over Norman Vincent Peale, the cognitive model says that in fact there are core beliefs that you have, and I'm going to explain each of these. I just want you to see the overall picture. And that there, in addition to a horizontal, there's a vertical interaction. So you hold certain beliefs, you engage in certain cognitive processes, which we will describe in a minute, and that results in the thoughts which then produce, the conscious thoughts which produce the emotional or mood reaction. So, for example, if I pass John, who I enjoy talking to a lot, we've had a couple of lunch discussions and really have some similarities in background, and if I pass him on campus and he walks by and doesn't speak to me, I might say, what? Well, John really doesn't like me. And if John doesn't like me, then, I'd feel bad. Because so far, we've gotten along pretty well. Yeah. On the other hand, maybe John, an alternative thing would be, well, John's having a bad day. I mean, he's under a lot of pressure over here, and he's working really hard, and he's highly successful, and thought was a million miles away, and it really had absolutely nothing to do with me. So the point being that how I'm going to feel depends on what the automatic thought is. The automatic thought's going to depend to some extent on my core belief. How much do I worry about what other distinguished professors think about me when I pass them on campus? How much do I worry about what graduate students think? How much do I worry about my colleagues? Plus, it may be compounded by making some cognitive errors. So John passes me by and doesn't speak to me, and that's really strange. I just passed Corey Keyes a couple of hours ago, and he didn't speak to me either. In fact, the longer I'm here at Emory, I find out a lot of these people don't speak to me. People here, I'm going back to Duke. At least they got a basketball team. Sorry. I got in trouble for using that one once before, so I'll stop there. They're going to lose anyway, even though I like them. But the point being, though, that you may go from one event to lots of other events. So let's talk about actually how that happens. So if we go across the top, the automatic thoughts, what are they? Well, generally in depression, I'm going to talk about that, and then we'll talk about the flip side. They're negatively valenced ideas. They're typically distorted. So, for example, if we bring in depressed college students and run them through an experiment and give them feedback for what they've done, they underestimate how many they got right, and they're actually pretty accurate with the negative side, how many they got wrong. It's the sociopaths who say, well, I didn't get as many wrong as I did, but they certainly remember all the positive ones. They occur pretty spontaneously, sort of if you just pass somebody and they happen, sort of like some of those comments on the video we saw. They generally fall into categories about the self, the future, and the world, and the main thing is that they engender depressive or anxious affect. So if we look at the model, what we're saying is that's this part. It's automatic, it's spontaneous, and for those people who are having difficulties, they generally are negative. For the people who are really happy or flourishing, they're generally positive. But they're also tied to cognitive errors and core beliefs. So let's look at the cognitive errors. What kinds of things are there that go on? Well, first of all, there's all or nothing thinking. This is really important to what we're talking about. Namely, where it really is a problem is when it ties into perfectionism, which is what we're going to focus on. But the all or nothing thinking is dichotomous thinking. People who see the world simply in yes, no, black, white terms. And there's not sort of a gray area in between. It's all sort of success or failure. The problem with this comes with perfectionism, as we'll see, is that some people tend to move that bar up. And if it gets high enough, then you have very, very few successes in life. And that level of perfectionism, which I know from the scale some of you have, in fact, creates problems. Overgeneralization, a good example of that I gave earlier about going from John to Corey. Mind reading. If any of you are married, this causes a lot of marital problems. You know what your spouse or partner's thinking before you get home, and you read into whatever they say what you think they're thinking. Minimization, that is not taking credit for positive events that happen. There are a couple people here that have been working with Marty Seligman. Some of his earlier work focused on this. But more importantly, excessive responsibility. So if something negative happens, what you say is, it's my fault. In fact, negative things happen in all of my life. Indeed, over the course of my life, negative things have been happening. And that kind of thinking is a cognitive error that creates a lot of difficulty. Again, moving quickly, these are tied then to core beliefs. The core beliefs are sort of epistemological givens. That is, these are things that you really believe sort of deep down inside. They're your a priori assumptions that you had by the time you came to law school. They probably are learned over the course of your life, and in fact may be maladaptive learning. I one time was hanging some, what do they call them now, window treatments with my father. They were curtains when we were growing up. And we were putting them in very carefully with screws, and my father said, "It's taking a long time, let's just nail them in." At which point my mom was walking by and said, "Well, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing right." And I thought, 35 years of that. No wonder I had issues with this, right? So common examples are, you may not be fully aware of this if you hold to it, but I must do everything perfectly in order to be okay. It's not this part that's so bad, of doing things really well, but it's in order to be okay. An alternative one is, everyone must love and approve me all the time. So this gives us the two things that we're going to talk about, and they're the two things for which we I actually had you complete the questionnaires. I'll talk about that in just a second. But the perfectionism is a combination of excessively high standards and dichotomous thinking, so that you have to exceed that excessively high standard in order to be okay. And the second is that you have to be approved by everyone all the time in order to be okay. So let me have the caveat and show you that I've actually, for the last 24 hours, very much had to use my own model on myself. There was a mistake in the transmission of the scoring keys for the questionnaires you completed. I'm going to show you valid data. If you're interested in where you stand on this, after seeing the valid data, we've arranged for you to be able to go back and complete the questionnaire again, and you'll have accurate data. You may not have it with you anyway, but if you want to know where you stand relative to people here in normative standards, then you can do that. Having said that, when I recognized this, it was a mistake. And I berated myself for a little while. Fortunately, I'm married to a good cognitive therapist who runs the doctoral program in psychology, who said, "Well, you'll get to practice your own thing." So I've done it. It's over with. Let's move forward. I'm really sorry, and I ask your forgiveness, but sometimes mistakes happen. It did not have any effect, fortunately, on Dr. Key's data, so I won't explain any more about it. I'll show you the real data, though. So, for example, if we summarize these dysfunctional thoughts, so this is sort of a composite based on these a priori assumptions in the questionnaires that you completed, and this is scored correctly. So you can see that for the general population, the average score was 118, the standard deviation is 26. Your average score is 127, which would be consistent with the notion that you have a slightly higher level of anxiety and depression. If you want to say it in a more practical way, your average score is at the your mean score is at the 35th percentile of the population. Did I say that backwards? Your score is, in this case, the mean score is 127 versus a score in the population of 119. So on average, you're a third of a standard deviation higher than the population or the norms for your group. But what's driving this? And this is the part that matters. Number one is perfectionism. So I can't compare it. There aren't good norms, but we know that the average is about 27. So you can see that somewhere around 20 or so % of this group is in a range on this score that would make me believe that you're having issues surrounding the concept of, I must do everything perfectly in order to be okay. Okay, if we go to need for approval, your average score on this is 9. The population average is about 11. So basically, again, you're actually a little better in this case. So that's good, I think, although there is an alternative interpretation, is that you really don't care as much about what people think about you. And, of course, in the extreme form, that's sociopathy. And that's not any better in terms of functioning than that creates the white-collar crime kind of issue where people are enormously successful, and part of it is that they don't care what other people think about them. So what I would encourage you to do, if you have any concerns at all about this, as you've listened to what we talked about, you go back and take the questionnaire. It's about 10 minutes. We've already arranged for it. It's rescored so that now the score you get back will tell you where you belong. You can remember, if we go back, that the average score for the total is 127. The average score for perfectionism is 35. And these don't mean anything relative to each other. And the average score for need for approval is 9. So to quickly kind of wrap this up with 5 minutes of sort of suggestions about what you can do in terms of this model. Number one is to work toward a slight positive bias. As I mentioned earlier, people who are adaptive, who do not have depression and anxiety problems, actually are able to say things slightly more positively to themselves than the world really is. Freud may have been wrong about a lot of things, but one of the things he talked about was depressive realism, and he's indicated that people who have depression, in fact, see the world the way it really is, and that's generally true for negative things, but they don't see the positive things. What you want to do in terms of the slight positive bias is to move in the direction of taking credit for the positive things you do and downplaying a bit the negative things that happen in your life. I could talk about specific procedures, but you can't do that in 20 minutes, so maybe there can be some questions if you want about that. Secondly, to learn self-monitoring and cognitive change procedures. One of the things that we find hardest with not just teenagers but with adults is if you were to say to me, well, this is what's happened to me today. Okay, so think about some event today. The next thing that we usually think about in the U.S. is how did I feel? But in fact, the critical thing about how you felt is what you said to yourself when the event happened. And so we train people in the cognitive change procedures to actually learn to identify what that is. Sometimes there's a problem with alexithymia, as psychiatrists refer to it, namely, you don't know labels for your feelings. But even if you know them, what we have to do is to teach people how what they're saying affects how they feel. And what you can control is not the feeling, but what you can control is what you're saying to yourself through that process that we talked about earlier, from your thoughts to your processes to your underlying beliefs. The ultimate goal, of course, being to change that underlying belief. A critical example of that we see in first year a lot in the first year medical students is that you're all of a sudden here in law school and you're competing with a lot of people who are really smart. And then you go out in the world and you start your job and it starts all over again. And you're used to being one of the top people in your class because that's the way you're selected. And so you get back your first exams and you're average or below average. And the sort of automatic thought that people have is, I don't belong here. What's the underlying belief that people worry about? I'm stupid, or at least stupid in a relative sense. I'm not good enough. I see a lot of assistant professors who go through this same sort of thing where when they leave academia in their PhD and they come into graduate school, well, you know, I'm just not going to make it. I'll never get enough grants. I'll never get enough papers, etc. And therefore, I don't belong. When in fact, some of the very best, the people who have that turn out to be the very best in the long run, but they have to work at it. The other thing, keeping with the Carnegie report, is to be sensitive to clients who have these issues. I have a patient, bipolar patient, who's going through a really nasty divorce right now. His lawyer has been his salvation because he's really sensitive to what he's going through with the stress of the divorce. And both the lawyer and the patient have talked to me about it. I think that's a really important aspect. It's not just mental health. I mean, there are many other stressors that we could talk about. So in summary, cognitions at all levels, automatic thoughts, cognitive processes, underlying beliefs affect how we feel and behave. The cognitions of most significance that we've talked about today for you probably are perfectionism and need for approval. They're malleable and their change can lead you toward flourishing, which brings us to the talk about optimism or flourishing. And I put a quote up here from David Landis, emeritus professor at Harvard, on the wealth and poverty of nations. You don't have to agree with his entire book, but I think this is a really interesting point. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to warn you ahead of time, this is not my normal voice. For those of you who know me, this is my head cold voice. This is very different, but the theme was Prevail, and as I told April, we will prevail today. This cold will not get the best of me. So I'm going to jump right in and tell you what I hope to accomplish with the talk, and which is the point I want to make is to raise the question, do we have the correct priorities for the era we now live in terms of the standards by which we judge accomplishments and whether we're focusing on the right objectives, reducing illness or promoting health. I want to start out right away by making a statement I hope is at least a little provocative, that I believe we live in an era where the quality of our life is now much more important than the quantity of our life. The first priority. Now, we've inherited from the last century the objective of adding more years of our life, and we continue to wish to add more years of our life because in the 20th century that was a real problem. At the beginning of the 20th century, we lived on average 40 to 50 years, and by the end of that century, we added 30. Now, it's true that it's not equal in all populations, and that's not my point, but it doesn't matter whether you live in a developed nation or a developing nation. We have been adding years and quantity to our life. This is not the only place where quantity matters to Americans. More is always better than quality. And you see that in the way we eat and how we drink. And if you want to see a testament to it, go to France. They would think we are rather disgusting in the way we approach our food and our drink, because we want more, they want less with higher quality. So we live in an era, I think, where we really have to change this fascination with quantity and start shifting towards quantity, because we live longer. And I would like to suggest that disease and illness are no longer the most serious issues facing our civilization. Don't get me wrong, and don't put this in the paper and quote me wrong, but I'm not saying it's not serious. It will always be serious. But I believe now we live in an era where infectious diseases do not shorten our life abruptly. We live in an era where we live a long time with chronic diseases. We can live a long life with chronic diseases. And as Ed is, I think, alluded to quite poignantly that mental illness starts early and it's a recurrent, chronic, unrelenting condition. Guess what? The focus on mental illness and trying to tackle it is not succeeding with the current approach. So I'll get to that. What is the problem? I believe the problem facing our civilization today that's more serious than illness and disease is that we have no idea what happiness or genuine health really is, let alone how to promote it in our lives. So I'd like to illustrate that point today by focusing on what I know best, or at least I'd like to think so, the domain of mental health. Now, when it comes to the term mental health, maybe I was supposed to switch this slide here. Let me get this up here. I'll get to this term. I won't deal with the slides for a little while. Mental health, and this is the term I use because mental health is a rather confusing term. Now, in the Canadian context, I've been working a lot with the Canadians and the government to implement what it is I study on a population level, and I hope someday we can do that here. But they commissioned a study in 2007 and asked Canadian adults, they put two terms in front of them, mental health and mental illness. Are these about the same, exactly the same, or distinctly different things? 40% of Canadian adults said they are distinctly different things. And guess what? They got it right. Science supports that, which is to say that the absence of mental illness does not mean that you are anywhere close to mentally healthy. They're two different things. Bad news is 6 out of every 10 Canadian adults believe that mental health and mental illness are about or exactly the same thing. And they've got it wrong. But not wrong in a sort of procedural sense, because this is the way our healthcare system, our institutions operate. We believe that if we can eradicate all mental illness, we will suddenly have a mentally healthy population. That's wrong, in fact, and I'll get to that. So, 40% only have the right conception of what mental health and mental illness are in the population. We have a long way to go, and I suspect if we did that survey here, it would be no different. I would anticipate. I don't think we're any smarter, so to speak, about the difference between mental health and illness. But here's the problem. It's been over 60 or 70 years that people have been writing this mantra that health is more than the absence of illness. I can go back to a book published in 1941 by a well-known medical historian named Henry Sigerist called Medicine and Human Welfare. And on page 100, he says this: health is more than the absence of illness. It is something positive. Notice the terms. I want to play with those two last terms, something positive. That is the vaguest referent that I've ever heard of anything that should matter in life. And here's what I think what they are getting at, Sigerist and the rest of the people, because they haven't studied it until recently. He's saying that health is more than the absence of illness. It is something positive. It appeases the idealist in all of us, doesn't it? And then it insinuates something even worse, that we'll get to the matter of good health, that positive stuff, when we've dealt with a far more serious thing, that is illness, disease. In other words, illness is far more serious than health. I believe, again, I want to make very clear, it's wrong. I do believe that in my heart of heart, and I have the scientific evidence to back it up, I'd like to say. And we'll never solve the problem of mental illness or physical illness entirely. Guess what? Because germs and viruses evolve. We will always be plagued with disease and illness. And we will always be plagued with mental illness. We might not call it that in the future, I hope, because sometimes it's a normal reaction to a very sick world that we live in. Right now, we medicalize too much, and we focus only on fixing the individuals and letting a society and its problems fester. Things like inequality, racism, sexism, to name only a few. But we'll never reduce the amount of illness, mental or physical, in this country until we bring in the sharper focus, true health and happiness. And flourishing is the term I've used now to make it very clear, and that I've developed scientifically to really bring into, I hope, sharper focus, the nature of what good mental health really is all about and what I think we really need to prioritize. When we're teaching our students, we should prioritize flourishing. Students should end their academic career at a place as Emory. More of them should be flourishing than started, not the obverse. So, flourishing, where does it come from, right? We're here to talk about happiness. Huh? Well, it turns out flourishing, at least scientifically, borrows very deeply from two kinds of happiness that have been talked about by the ancients, by the religious community and scholars for years. We tend to think of happiness only in the first tradition, and that is happiness is about feeling, emotion. It's about feeling good. This goes all the way back to Epicurus, the great Greek philosopher, who said if you want to be happy, you need to surround yourself with friends, freedom from encumbrances, and time for reflection when things go wrong. He had a very simple formula for feeling good. But this comes from the Greek hedonic tradition of happiness, which is to say, maximize pleasure, which is a term meant to refer to maximize good feeling. Utilitarians, you know probably very well, have made a great philosophy out of maximizing happiness in this tradition. What we tend to forget is there's a second tradition of happiness, and that is happiness is functioning up to a level of excellence. This comes from none other than Aristotle. And he had a term for happiness, and he called it eudaimonia, you for good, and daemon, to find that true spirit that is you and develop it. And later I want to have a discussion with Ed and with the audience of, is there a good and a bad form of perfection? Because when I read Aristotle, I hear a version of perfectionism. Perfect who you are. I don't know if that perfectionism that Ed's talking about is that version, but I want to raise that here because I think it's a very interesting debate, and I'm having my seminar students on happiness debate this right now. Perfectionism, the bad kind, perfectionism, the good kind. But the point here is one tradition champions feeling good, and the other says, well, happiness is about functioning well in life. It's not at all about feeling good. Sometimes functioning well may preclude feeling good, doing your duty, rising to a level of honor, doing the right thing. Should that always make us happy and satisfied? I'm not so sure. Well, flourishing, for me, scientifically, is the following. It is the combination of these two traditions. Of course, it requires hedonia, feeling good about a life. But it's also the combination of the other thing, which is eudaimonia. It's that sweet spot where human beings feel good about a life in which they're functioning well. And let me say that again, because this is quite rare. You should feel good about a life in which you're capable of functioning well. Now, why is that a problem? We do a lot of studies on happiness, and most of the time we focus on the hedonic stuff. We ask people how happy they are. And study after study shows the following thing. 91% of American adults say the following. They are quite happy or very happy with their life. 91%. Only 9% say that they're not very happy with the life that they're living. This is not just true of America. It's true of Great Britain. They do the same thing. Now, I beg your indulgence, how does that fit with the following facts that we sociologists catalog on a daily basis? That more Americans also, at the same time, report increasing levels of stress in their life. Study after study shows this. More malaise, more depression. There's more chronic physical disease. There's more obesity. There's more social problems today. In fact, more kids are growing up in poverty today than they were 20 years ago. And there's the collapse of institutions. And if you ask Americans, our morality and our civility is waning. I could go on. Now, how is it that Americans, 9 out of every 10, say they can feel good about life in which they are not? They are not, I submit to you, functioning well, or living in a society that's functioning well. Well, there's one, we adapt. We can adapt to the most pitiful circumstances. The second, I will not ask right now, but I have another theory, but let's move on. So the important point is you need to be looking at both of these things because you would mistakenly be led to the conclusion everyone is happy, so there's no problems here. Yet 20 to 30% of Americans report depression and other common mental disorders on an annual basis. 50% will report a serious mental disorder in a lifetime. Age of onset of depression has been declining over the last 20 to 30 years. It's happening earlier and earlier. I mean, right? Something is dreadfully wrong. And I think our founding fathers would say, we have prioritized the individual pursuit of happiness in the wrong places to the exclusion of the greater good, functioning well. So my approach to flourishing mirrors the way psychiatrists actually approach mental illness, particularly depression, which is to say, it's the obverse, in fact. To be depressed is to have a certain level of anhedonia and a certain number of symptoms of malfunctioning. So the way we diagnose and go about measuring mental health is no different. So what is it? You took the survey. I'll go quickly. There's 14 items now. We can measure it quite rapidly. We've got it down to 14 items, but all of these items represent distinct dimensions that both adolescents and adults in both this country as well as in some European countries consider very important. So during the past two weeks, how often did you feel any of the following? Happy, interested in life, or satisfied? This represents the quintessential hedonic tradition. We call it emotional well-being. Everyone knows happiness as this in the pink. The next 11 symptoms, first 5 of which represent positive functioning. In blue, you have 5 dimensions of what we sociologists call social well-being, which is functioning well in your public life. So how often in the past week did you feel this, that you had something important to contribute to this thing we call society? That you belonged to a community, like a social group or a neighborhood? That you felt that our society, this country, is becoming a better place for people like you? How often did you feel that other people are basically good by nature? How often, number 8, did you feel that the way our society works makes sense to you? Those are dimensions of social contribution, social integration, social growth, social acceptance, and social coherence. They matter deeply. But it's not just about public pursuits, it's also about these remaining 6 things, which represent what we would call psychological well-being, functioning well in your sort of private life, if you will, which isn't divorced from society. But number 9, we call that self-acceptance, that you liked most parts of your personality, that you were good, number 10, at managing the responsibilities of your daily life. We call that environmental mastery. Number 11, that you had warm and trusting relationships with other people, positive relationships, these are intimate relationships. Number 12, that you experienced personal growth, that you had experiences that challenge you to grow and become a better person. 13, we call that autonomy. How often did you feel confident to think or express your own ideas and opinions? What I thought was the canonical part of what a democracy was about. And last but not least, number 14, that your life had a sense of direction or meaning, purpose in life. It's a pretty long list when you start to try to catalog, are you functioning well? And these are color-coded because whether you test this in South Africa, which we have done, in the Dutch population, in young kids ages 12 to 18, in the United States, or adults, it's the same 3 things that matter. Feeling good and functioning well both publicly and privately. So how do we diagnose this? Again, I call this the mental health continuum, and it's going north-south because it's quite distinct from the mental illness continuum. But the way we diagnose it is as follows. You are truly mentally healthy if you had one of those 3 in the pink almost every day or every day in the last 2 weeks, plus 6 of the 11 positive functioning, every day or almost every day. In other words, you only need 7 out of the 14, but you need 1 of the 3 from emotional well-being, 6 of the 11 from positive functioning. That's barely 50% of the total list of things that would go into good mental health. Not bad. That's where we want people. Here is the problem that we haven't recognized in our society, and it's a true problem that the ancients actually talked about a lot. But I won't mention it here, but it's called languishing. It's truly the absence of good mental health. You're languishing if you said you never or maybe once or twice in the last 2 weeks felt one of those three: emotional well-being, plus you never or maybe once or twice in the last 2 weeks felt 6 of the 11 positive functioning. What does it mean to languish? It means to feel stuck, stagnant, devoid of meaning in life. Read Tolstoy's Confession. At the height of his career and his success, he writes about this condition poignantly. And people who have the accoutrements of success often wonder, why is it that I feel empty? It's this. So if you're not flourishing or languishing, you're somewhere in between. We couldn't find a better term for it. So it's moderate. All right. Before I get to the data, and we'll end here, I wanted to situate. We've used this questionnaire now. We used to have a very long form. We've got it down to a short form. We've been using it in what we are calling the Healthy Mind Study that comes out of the University of Michigan, which is done on an annual basis. And I've been participating and helping with this study. Very supportive, because I believe mental health and mental illness on college campuses really needs to be recognized and taken far more serious than we have in the past. 2007 was the first year we actually fielded the study, and we were able to get 13 campuses involved. And notice at number 5, Emory was part of this, and they actually have been part of it every 2 years since then. But I wanted to give you a list of these. These are college students. Some of them are graduate students. Most of them are undergraduates. We collected data from almost 6,000 students. So those are the campuses. We gave them my mental health continuum short form, and we gave them a bunch of measures used for screening mental illnesses. For you psychiatrists or clinical psychologists that are interested, we used the patient health questionnaire to diagnose screening depression, anxiety, and panic disorder. So, before I get to the Happy Lawyers survey, I wanted to situate this in terms of college students. And I guess I should ask you first, given what you know about the criteria now, how many college students do you believe are truly mentally healthy, that is, flourishing? Any takers? How about you? How many do you believe are flourishing? Take a guess. 35. Higher or lower, anyone? Lower. Ooh, you guys are very pessimistic. No. Well, it's better news then. It's better news than you would think, but it's not terribly good news. 54% was the average in the 2007 study, and this is the highest level of good mental health that I've been able to find in our country. Guess what? It gets worse as adults. It goes down. But this is good news because we thought it was worse. We thought it was 3 out of 10. At least half. 42% had what we call moderate, and only 4% were languishing. That's good news, but that's relatively high. Now, interesting, and when you look at the range of flourishing, just from those 13 campuses, it was almost a 20% spread. It was 43% on some college campuses and almost up to 63% in some. That's only 13 campuses. Imagine if we actually queried most of the campuses in this country. And then we started to study the question, is that a selection effect, or is it really due to the kinds and the quality of education that these kids are getting? That's a question we really need to study, in my opinion. But that's where we're sort of comparing against. And I came into this thinking you law students were doing worse, but guess what? The news isn't so bad. Not so bad. But if I had a glass here, this would be the quintessential, is the glass half full or half empty, as I mentioned in our talk earlier. 51% were flourishing. This is not bad. 42% were moderate, but here's the bad news. 7% were languishing. Or put it this way. This isn't actually, you could look at this as good news or bad news. But if you add together moderate and languishing, it's almost half of the student body are at risk for serious mental illness. I want to raise the question, we now have data. A paper was just accepted in the American Journal of Public Health, and we have longitudinal data where we followed up American adults over a 10-year period. We measured them in 1995 and used the same measures in mental health in 2005. And you would be amazed how much it changes. Half of those people who were languishing in 95 went on to have better mental health in 2005. That's the good news. But another half who were flourishing, only half stayed flourishing, the rest of them lost it. Went down to moderate and some to languishing. And moderate, about 18% went up and another 13% went down. It was almost an equal exchange of gains and losses. But so I mentioned that because this is changeable. We don't know exactly why these changes are happening, but here is why we care about those changes. If you stayed or became moderate, or you stayed or became languishing, you are between 4 to 8 times more likely to have a new mental illness in 2005 compared to those who became or stayed flourishing. And in fact, if you were moderate or languishing, you had as high a risk of developing a future mental illness as those who started out with the 3 mental disorders we were measuring in 1995, which was depression, panic disorder, and generalized anxiety. And almost half of the adult population in this country are free of any of those 3 things, yet are less than mentally healthy. In other words, we're not focusing on the right things again. It's the absence of mental health that I believe is putting people at risk for falling into these categories of mental illness that we need to prioritize. So loss of positive mental health clearly seems to be a precursor, if you will, I dare to use the term, although in this data, cause. Also, we have data now to show that if you were flourishing in 1995, at all ages for men and women, your risk of premature death during that period was reduced. At all ages for males and females. It doesn't matter whether you are a young adult, middle-aged, or the oldest adult in our study, which was up to the age of 75. If you were flourishing, the risk of death, controlling for all other known causes of mortality, if you were flourishing, you were protected. Anything less, your risk of death. And we've dug into that, and it's because there's bad health habits, smoking, drinking, lack of exercise. If you're not flourishing, you're slipping into habits that will help us to explain why it is you're getting into this spiral of either death or disease. We've also got it showing that anything less than flourishing in 1995, and you were likely to develop a new form of a heart disease in 2005. So we started out and got rid of anyone who had heart disease to start with in 1995, and we looked at whether 1995 level of good mental health, irrespective of mental illness, predicted the development of new heart disease. Bingo. And that's controlling for all other things, cardiovascular, high blood pressure, smoking, drinking, exercise, age, you name it. I could go on. We've shown that anything less than flourishing results in more disability at all ages, more days of work missed in a typical month, and this is net of any mental illness, and less use of health care in terms of medical visits for physical reasons, for mentally emotional reasons, and last but certainly not least, the use of prescription medicines. It's not just mental illness, it's the absence of mental health that's driving this. So I want to conclude here by asking you the following. You all know what your recommended daily allowance is for, right? Good fruits and vegetables. I'm not saying you do it. I don't either. Although I try my best. I eat my grapefruit in the morning, my banana for lunch to make sure, and then my wife and I eat together at night, and we make sure we get the 3rd fruit and veggie. But if we don't eat together, I'm terrible. But we do know that. We also are increasingly proficient in knowing that our cognitive health, it requires mental stimulation and an active mind and throughout life. If you don't use it, you will lose it, is the mantra now. What are you getting your recommended daily allowance of meaning in life? That's really what we're measuring. 1 of 3 emotional well-being, 6 of 11 positive functioning, every day or almost every day. If you're not getting that here, at home, in your work, something's wrong. And last but not least, I wanted to end with, well, we have some suggestions how, because we've starting how do people flourish? College students and adults. One is, and these will seem obvious to many of you, but one is they have a way of approaching bad situations. That they feel and they engage in activities that they can change a bad situation or a less than ideal situation into something that's better. Not ideal, maybe it's not dichotomous thinking, but they do try that. Second, they learn. They see difficult situations as chances to learn about themselves and life. And Aristotle would be very happy because that's wisdom in progress. Third, they feel really cared for by somebody in their life. You might want to call that love, but we just ask them, do you feel really cared for? Almost 100% of flourishing. Anything less, and there's something missing in terms of feeling really cared for. Fourth, you want to know the key to flourishing is? Have you asked yourself seriously lately, what do you really want out of life? We asked that question, and only the flourishing adults knew really what they wanted out of life. And last but certainly not least, we've been measuring this in college students in the spirit of wanting out of what you know. Are you prioritizing the right things? Well, we found that most people, if you ask them the 14 signs and symptoms of good mental health, how important all of them are to your life, guess which ones they prioritize? Feeling good. Psychological well-being comes in second place, and that social well-being comes in dead last. In other words, kids and students and adults they think feeling good about life is far more better than functioning well in it. And that has to change. You will never flourish unless you prioritize feeling good in a lot of life in which you can function well. So I'll leave you with that, and I hope we have a robust conversation about this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to Professor Craighead and Professor Keyes for getting us off to a wonderful start to a great conversation, I hope. I'm going to let them talk with the two of them back and forth a bit, and then invite you, as they're talking, to come to the middle of the auditorium and to use the microphones to put your questions. Brevity is the soul of wit and the insistence of witty. If you have a question, please be brief, and we also ask you to be profound. Ask whatever question you want, actually. These are great men in the law, great men in the profession, and great men in mental health and social health, and they have a good sense of how to address your questions. So put them to them. Any question will do, but put it pithily, please, no speeches. But let's have them talk back and forth a bit, and then invite you to come to the microphones.
Okay, I had sort of two quick comments. Number one, I thought we actually were in agreement in terms of the hedonistic tradition and the eudaimonia, in that when I talked about cognitive processes, I talked about them affecting not only feeling state, which I focused on, but affecting behavior. I could have easily used the word functioning, and that came out of our many discussions about both of these being critical. So I think that I want to clarify that point. The second point in terms of the discussion about perfectionism is that there's really, and I know with this group and with good graduate students, the standards are high. There's absolutely nothing wrong with high standards. It's what you do, and I think this is what gets in the ancients. That what is important is what you do when you fall slightly short of that in terms of accepting yourself and adapting and liking yourself. I tried to be pithy.
Well, good points, and no argument. We are much more in agreement. Increasingly, by the way, this is an interesting conversation that people who are focusing on positive mental health and those who are focusing on mental illness, there's much more rapprochement than you would have imagined. And I'm very glad, because I think that ultimately we need to merge the negative and the positive, because there's a conversation that needs to be had. How do we respond to negative in our life so that it becomes the tools and resources that the ancients referred to as wisdom that begets flourishing? But I had a question for you, Ed. If you, and it gets back to this, and I alluded to it, about perfectionism. I wonder if it's on the audience's mind as well. You mentioned perfectionism, the bad kind, includes two things, excessively high standards and a dichotomous thinking. And I'm wondering, can perfectionism be made a little more beneficial if we remove the dichotomous thinking? Is there anyone studying that? And I think, is it the excessive standards? Because I would argue, or is it the dichotomous thinking that we need to deal with more or first?
Right. Well, I think to answer that directly, I tried to be clear, and I think this is the critical essence of it. It's the combination, the part that has to do with clinical issues and making people unhappy as well as dysfunctional is when you have the combination of the high standard with the dichotomous thinking. I've worked with a lot of like world-class athletes, and the standards can be high, but the ones who are great are the ones who make the mistake and come back. They don't interpret this as I'm a failure, I might as well stop. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with the high standards, and I would say that for all of you. I mean, that's why you're here. It's what you do with it, though, because everybody, including giving questionnaire scoring, everybody will sometimes make a mistake. And it's what you do with that that's going to determine how you're going to feel, but more importantly, or equally importantly, how well you're going to function, because that kind of perfectionism will interfere with the level of functioning, and that's where it becomes inconsistent with that view. I want to say just one other quick thing, and that is, to me, the essence of what Corey and positive psychology and flourishing really are important is in prevention of these disorders. And a lot of us are working on this around the world in different countries, and it's hard to do it in the U.S., but if you can prevent the first episode, for one thing, it'll keep you from having to answer that onerous question on the bar exam. But the important thing is you don't ever have that experience. And we know now that we can at least forestall it if, in fact, we can't prevent it ever happening. So I think you do that. How do you do that? Well, I would argue through these sort of cognitive developmental mechanisms to allow people to fall into the flourishing category.
Question over here, please.
I came to this seminar because I run the drug court program in DeKalb County. We've been doing it for 8 years. We have embraced the cognitive model as the way to change serious addiction. One of our biggest issues is the length of time it takes somebody, all the things you've talked about are dead on. What we have found is that people have all these cognitive errors. They've had them for their lifetime. We have started out with the program maybe being 2 years, because it takes that long, we thought. We are finding that it's getting more and more difficult to keep people engaged. And I'm wondering if there's research, or is there some general sense of how long you should keep at this before you finally let them go? Or do we just, because some of them don't ever want to leave. And there's a lot of dual diagnosis, but it's mostly cognitive. That's what we're working on. And I'm at a loss because I'm trying to find funding. I've got all these folks that seem to be doing well, but I don't know how long to keep them. And we're running the program ourselves. We do all the stuff, we run the program ourselves. And we have to make decisions.
You want to say it? I think that's obviously you're working with the most difficult population, the one that's in many ways had the least success in the research literature. The programs that have worked have started off, I think particularly about the work of Marcia Linehan at the University of Washington. She started off with a 6-month program thinking that was twice as long as the previous programs, and then it became a year, and now it's 2 years. I mean, there is obviously no answer. It's a very difficult question. Just to refer you, the people to contact about that, probably the best person is Alan Marlatt, which I'm sure you know, M-A-R-L-A-T-T at the University of Washington, and Bill Miller, who's emeritus at the University of New Mexico, who use these models with the particular populations.
Other questions? Timidity is not a characteristic that I would attribute to Emory Law students. Please.
At the risk of not being profound, are women lawyers 4 times more likely to be depressed or anxious based on your introductory remarks?
That's a good question, and unfortunately there's no answer to that data. I could not find anything on of the studies that were done. Most of them were done in the 90s that actually separated by gender. However, there's little reason to believe that there is such a strong self-selection factor that it would completely offset that. And so while there may, in fact, be some factors, unfortunately, we also didn't ask gender. I called California yesterday to the questionnaire people to try to get the answer to your question on perfectionism and dysfunctional attitudes, and we didn't ask you that. We did such a good job, in fact, of protecting your confidentiality, we couldn't even rescore your data. You'll have to go do it again. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer, but I do know that across professions in the epidemiological studies, the little bit that we have, there are no differences.
Please.
Corey and Ed, thank you both very much for a very stimulating conversation this afternoon. Most of the people in the room today have been through law school and know how stressful an enterprise law school is, as all professional schools are. In addition to the normal stressors, today's law students face a severely contracted job market and a high debt load, and those are facts. Can you comment on how students that are striving to flourish can handle these external factors that impose significant burdens on sense of well-being?
Well, let me be cautious and say that, yeah, I wish I had the answers to that, but I'm also hoping that President Obama and others can help us fix that, right, in the administration, this economy. But while that's not realistic, I suspect we're not going to be coming out of this recession anytime soon, according to most pundits. I thought one answer I would like to draw on again from the video. You remember the young man who actually said, well, right now the job opportunities are pretty limited, but this has given me a chance to sort of think about other things and do other things about life and discover this and that about myself and the world. Sounds to me like there is a young man who's going to be flourishing despite a rather difficult economic situation, and the fact that even if he doesn't get a job right off the bat that fits the career he maybe thought he would pursue, spending 3 years here. Is that the only answer? Well, no, but the fact of the matter is, work is pretty important. But it's not the only answer to flourishing, and our founding fathers knew that, and Adam Smith knew that very well in The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiment. Said it's actually a necessary deception to think that pursuing the wealth and all of that it's good for the economy and growth, but that's not where you're going to find sustainable happiness and satisfaction. In fact, where you're going to find it is in your communities, in religion, and education, and in service to others. So I think that wisdom is still as relevant today as it was 200 years ago, in this context especially. So in the absence of job opportunities, there are plenty of other places where human beings need each other. And any creative thinking where you can get involved and help others creates a world where we're more likely to flourish. Now, to the high debt, I was actually thinking about this today, and I've talked about this to my students. I can't think that institutions such as Emory, and yes, I know this is recorded, so I say this actually because we have to start saying this, because the cost of education is getting so high that on the one hand, we're saying we want students coming out with a moral imagination, ignited ethically to go serve the world. And yet, the first thing they have to think about is paying off a huge debt, because if they've gone to schools like this where they have to pay $40,000 to $50,000 a year. And that's just getting through undergraduate. And I talk to my students, how are you possibly going to choose the career of, voluntary lawyer and doctor where people most need you, where you might find your real calling in life, when you have $150,000 to $200,000 in debt just from your education, and you're thinking of actually putting a roof over your house. The most institutions, Emory included, say on the one hand, we want students to go serve the world, and second, we want you to pay through the nose, so how can you do both? And it's not realistic, so until we really tackle that question, I'm sorry, but the sociologist in me says you can't ask for both. Go ahead.
I make two quick descriptive comments, and if you want elaboration. Number one, we've been working in Iceland in prevention of depression for now 6 years of the actual program, and this, as you know, the country declared bankruptcy over the issue with Britain, and the Minister of Health and Minister of Education have asked us to implement the program in the country, and we're currently doing the pilot study. We had our regular cutoffs for the people who were at risk, and these are not clinical cutoffs, but they're people at risk for clinical problems. And we knew that we would get about 25%, and we budgeted accordingly. Well, it was more than twice that who scored above that cutoff this year versus the previous years. So I think there is an economic impact. And that's one piece of data that I know of relevant to that. I think the second thing I want to say is that this really underscores the importance of the cognitive aspects of what you're doing, because many of you will not get the jobs when you finish that you otherwise might have gotten, but you will eventually, if you're good and you stay with it, you can be a very successful lawyer in your chosen profession. But it's going to challenge your ability cognitively to sustain your staff in the absence of the external validation. It will really be helpful to do that internally. And there are many self-help books about how you can do that without having a mental illness and needing a medicine.
I'm having to go back to my undergraduate philosophy courses, so if I get this wrong, let me know. Hi, Corey. I seem to remember Aristotle equates eudaimonia and being a good person to a lot of it has to do with habit and being around other good people instead of trying a codified system. So I guess I'm wondering if in your research there's any measurement of how much the will has to do with either eudaimonia or hedonia. I mean, you know, if I get depressed, somewhere in me, I've noticed I have a habit of just saying, I'm tired of doing this, and I'm going to feel good now. And I know that's not always available or possible, but how much of it is subject to the will? And for people who are having trouble getting a job, don't worry, it takes about 2 years out of law school, and everyone tends to land where they need to land.
That's a good restructuring technique.
Yeah. Well, I forget which. You're correct. Aristotle did say that there are certain things that we don't learn rationally. We have to do. I believe he was speaking of sort of the moral kinds of things, which we're doing the right thing. That we can still learn it, but we have to learn it through habit. That is, doing it again and again, and being around other people who do this. This is where your professors come in. We should be leading by examples, and if you don't see us leading lives where we're telling you to lead happy lives where you're both functioning well and happy, I suspect we're falling short, because Aristotle would say we adults should be the examples that kids live up to. So I'll leave it there. But the fact of the matter is we're telling our kids to be happy, but we adults are the least. So we've got to get our stuff together. You almost heard that. I almost said.
My name is Susie Life. I'm an Emory alum, and I think most of us would agree that the lifestyle of practicing law has intrinsic challenges, if not unique challenges. Somewhere in the information for this program, I saw the word conflict, and I think that's as good a place to start as any in examining the issues that particularly affect lawyers. I'd like to hear either of you or both of you speak on how you think that makes our job to be happy harder.
Well, one thing I thought about, and in 20 minutes, it's hard to, you really have to cut out a lot of the substance. But one of the things I think that's inherent in the legal profession is in a lot of the things that you do, there's a winner and a loser. And that means that it's really essential that you be able to structure those situations in your thinking that doesn't make you as a person a loser. Because it's when you get to that extreme, then you do wind up leading yourself down a path toward depression. And I don't mean the medicalizing of that, but I'm talking about the affective state and the dysfunctional state that comes with that way of thinking. Conflict management, there's a whole area around, built out of this sort of approach of dealing with conflict. And a part of it has to do, it's just too complicated to explain in detail, but with recognizing emotions and engaging in emotion regulation behaviors, which the gentleman earlier, that's relevant to what he's talking about, so that you don't get distressed from the conflict. I think the workload, the young lawyers that I've treated or been involved with, the workload when you're a junior person trying to make partner is the biggest factor that contributes to that sort of stress taking a toll. I don't know if that's helpful, but I think the area of conflict management within this particular framework is very different from the old way of doing it, which was a set of 5 behaviors and feelings management.
And we have time. I'd like to actually argue with you and Ed. I don't know if you agree with his winners-losers portrayal of law. I have a wife who's in the practice of law. A part of it. And I think that's the way the Americans tend to approach it. And I think even if there are winners and losers, I think the profession of law, even so what there are losers on the individual case, all of society has been served by protecting rights. And society has been served, whether there were individual winners and losers. Right. We forget that. And just to recount, I was serving on duty, and I was sitting there in the room a couple months ago, and finally one of the judges came out and explained why it is that just sitting there to be called to duty, even if you don't get called, serves a purpose. And you want to know how that transformed the room? He explained, and she explained that the fact that you're sitting there, you want to know what that's doing? It's making people sit down and negotiate. Before that, everyone was vetching and complaining and, oh my God, I can't sit here, I can't sit here. And guess what? They finally realized those adults have to come out and explain to us the meaning of our actions are bigger than just the individual things. And it quieted the whole room. And he said, oh my God, even if I'm sitting here, I'm serving a purpose. So I think this winners-losers thing is too molecular, and we forget that adjudicating a case also serves all of society regardless of winning and losing. We've got to teach our students that.
A couple of things. First one is to answer your question about whether we think the glass is half full or half empty. I believe that this crowd will probably tell you it depends. and that depends on whether you're drinking or pouring. But to get to my...
I'm drinking.
To get to my actual question, I know that both of you spoke about statistics and models, and I really learned a lot about them, but I want to drive this conversation a little more practically here, especially for us students. What can you give us some tidbits of maybe tools that we can use when we are in those times when we feel bad or unhappy? You know, I mean, I know a couple of things. You know, I could go watch Schindler's List, or I could think of, you know, some guy on the street, but just wondering what you tell other people or maybe your clients. Thank you.
Well, I have a short one, and then I know Ed will have lots to say about this. But remember I alluded to Epicurus, and he said you needed time for reflection. Why? Because negative emotions are a necessary part of our life. They tell us that we need time to ourselves to think through. And this is simply not important. I'm not, again, this is not probably going to be the answer you want. You want tools. But the problem is, we sociologists think we're medicalizing normal sadness, and we're trying to get rid of it, when in fact it's a signal that you need time to think and talk to others about why it is things have gotten this way. When you reach out to other people or reflect on this, that's only when you learn. When you try to get rid of it, it's going to keep coming back and back. So I think that's the only answer I have. I know Dr. Craighead will have a lot more practical tools, but I think we have to stop medicalizing ordinary sadness and badness and start realizing that we need time for reflection. That's what it's signaling to us.
I think that's one of the actually places that we most overlap in that there's certainly some small minority where there's a very different picture, but even the people who are diagnosed with depressed, unless you're in the severe category, placebo works just as well as medicine or the most effective therapies. Why is that? Probably because we've medicalized the people who are normally sad and call them clinically depressed. But that's a longer discussion. But practically, I think there are two things that I could say, and I think you can get these. I'm not really big on bibliotherapy, but I think for people who, using books to help yourself, but if you can identify the feeling states, that's where you started with this, then learning what those are. Now, there's something called a multiple affect adjective checklist, has 132 adjectives on it of feeling states. And I once was treating a physician who said to me, I only know two. I get angry, so I punch the wall out, and I love my family. And I spent the rest of my life learning to shut down all the rest of my feelings, and I don't know what any of them are. Well, in some ways, lawyers are trained in somewhat the same model, to be in control of your affect and your feelings. And so they're learning to identify the feelings and then figuring out, and this is what we do in terms of technique. I had it and took it out. 3 columns where first you take the situation, you take the feeling, then you write down what it is that you were thinking associated with that feeling and what you were doing that was associated with that sad state, for example. You could also this model works on the other side. You can find when you were happy. Think about the last time you were really happy. What were you doing? Don't answer. But the point being that you were thinking or doing something, whether it's meaningful life, focusing on that, and that led to the sort of feeling state. And if you find that what you're doing is a lot of things in that second column, we then go to a 4th column where we plug in an alternative and then look at the alternative feeling state that produces and the alternative behaviors that come out of that. One more thing and I'll stop. That's sort of the horizontal level of what I talked about. There's also, at some point, you have to go down to the core of what Corey was talking about, and that is that there's something deeper. And I only picked the perfectionism and the need for approval as examples. There are many of these fundamental beliefs, like meaning of life, for example, and this not being meaningful. If you're spending all your time doing something that's not meaningful, then you're going to wind up both feeling bad and dysfunctional. So you got to go horizontally and you have to go vertically. And that's the really hard part. When you get to the part of the therapy that deals with, or intervention or in prevention programs, that deals with the underlying belief and coming to understand that. It's like some people here, for example, wrestled growing up with the issue of if there's a God or not a God. Now, I don't want to get into religion, but I'm saying resolving that is a really hard thing for one to work through. And it's the same sort of thing, maybe not in the spiritual sense, but it's the same sort of thing on these other fundamental beliefs about yourself and how they impact. And so real change occurs when the beliefs, you can move on the beliefs, and you don't have to go from languishing to flourishing. If you can move a little bit on the belief, it sort of goes out like that and has a big impact at the broader level of feeling and behavior.
Good stuff. We have 2 questions left. Let me ask you each to put your question and invite our panel to respond to the 2 questions, and then we're going to wrap it up so we can have our break. Please.
Hi, I'm Abe. I'm a law student. I'd like to know if you guys think that someone can be happy and truly flourish without in the long run being in love. And I don't mean loving your work or just having a brother that you're close with or friends that care about you, but I mean being in love, like in the intimate sense, in the romantic sense. And secondly, do you think that if a person has felt that before, if they can ever flourish again without it?
Collect your question too, and then we'll have a collective response.
Mine's a little bit different. Although I really want to know the answer to that question. I'd like to ask this of both of you. It's kind of interesting that we've had such an extreme polarization of political ideology in this country, especially recently. And I'm very curious as to whether or not you have looked at whether there's either a correlation or a causal relationship between both perfectionism and need for approval and flourishing and languishing among conservatives, liberals, and Tea Partiers.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
Well, let me go first, because there was a recent paper, not in the political sense, but in the sense of the people who have the most difficulty in functioning. So going back to the functioning part, are the people who are in the extremes. So tea sippers, tea parties, coffee, or wine sippers. But the point is that the people who ultimately wind up in difficulty with themselves and in functioning and work are the people who are at the extremes on the dimensions that I talked about. And both perfectionism and need for approval were included in that study, along with some other things. Corey? We'll come back to the love. That'll be a great place to end.
I was thinking there's somehow a joke, being a Catholic boy, the Catholics should be really happy now, because they're far from perfect these days, but that's maybe not, we don't want to go there. I don't know if I have an answer, although that's a great question. I'm particularly interested in it because I forced all my seminar students this semester to struggle with that, because I do think on the one hand we need standards of excellence set before us by our institutions where we work that line up with the flourishing, functioning well standards, because without standards of excellence to pull us along, human beings get very quickly drawn into their own individual passions and enthusiasms that draw them closer and closer towards only about hedonia and feeling good. And our founding fathers said we need to keep that balance. And that's a struggle in our Constitution between private interests and doing the greater good of society. And so we need those standards of excellence, and we need people striving for some form of perfection. It's the kind of extremes that Ed is talking about. I agree that in this polarization isn't a healthy place, because imagine your kids being raised in this. There's only one way to think about things. That was not the point of this country. And the democracy, as I understood it, was meant to be a deep working on individual character by listening deeply to each other. We can't even do that anymore. So I think we need to get back to that point where we can talk about standards of excellence publicly without trying to impose all these other standards, and yet maintain a healthy level of pursuing excellence. I don't know if that helps, but that's... I don't think, we haven't tested this, but it's clear that those who are flourishing have clear goals in life, and they know what they want out of life, and they're living up to standards, and we have yet to study whose standards, and are they virtuous and whatnot, but I suspect they're much closer to the perfectionism, but a healthy perfectionism. Because I believe that was the point of Aristotle, and this was the point of why we live in a society. A society has the right to expect certain things of individuals. They do. And it's simply the fact. And in exchange, you get individual rights and protection from law and other institutions. We've simply got to have that conversation. There's two kinds of happiness, public and private. We need that excellence. And I think it's very conducive to flourishing, but we haven't studied it.
Sometimes when there are two questions, you forget the first. So I'd like to come back to the love issue.
Yeah.
There are a lot
I'm with you, man. We need more love in this world.
There are a lot of song titles that come to mind, but I'm going to pass on those. I think the preponderance of the data would suggest that some kind of partnering over the course of life is actually facilitative of both adaptive functioning and feeling states. However, there certainly does not preclude the possibility of being at a high level of functioning, and there are people who are alone who function at very high levels and who feel very good about it. I think the real difficulty you sort of alluded to is to have tasted and lost and then to want that back again. And it takes a lot more work to do it on your own. And I would just go back to the thing of my wife yesterday sort of saying, well, use your own model with this. That I sort of was having a little trouble with that, and she made it really clear. Well, that's after 35 years of watching me come and go on various things. So somebody like that, I think, really facilitates those basic feelings that are a core of the flourishing. And if you look at the items that are on Corey's list, especially the personal ones, have to do with that kind of self-acceptance and being willing to, we connected to other people, to society, but also to accept yourself. That's probably the place.
And the last thing I want to say is a plug for His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. I think his message of compassion is at the heart of what it is that human beings need in order to flourish. And so the answer would be very simply, without compassion and love for other human beings in the world we live in, I think it's a very hard slog to flourish in life.
That's a wonderful way to end, and I think that these two gentlemen have vindicated their splendid reputations as great leaders in these fields. I think they deserve a robust round of applause. Dean Griggs and Dean Brokaw in the law school have been working very carefully with Jason Estevez and Brandon Goldberg and other leaders of the Student Bar Association to kind of bring these kind of questions very closely to bear on students' daily lives. We've been working very hard to let students try to discern their passions, to discern their calling, to find ways of discerning their gifts, and to use those discernment opportunities as a way to think about flourishing. And what this forum is an experiment to try to get to some texture in that activity together and in your own individual life. And we're going to be holding up these professional mirrors to you in the course of this next year as you begin as law students and as budding professionals to think about those deeper questions about ultimate vocation in the law. And I hope this has been a useful first exercise for you to continue that path. And I hope that we will continue to have opportunities for you in the course of this next year. You will see on your program that we indeed are going to end with the Dalai Lama on October 17 at a major conference on the campus where he will join in leadership with Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, with Presiding Bishop Catherine Shorey, and with Professor Nasser to summon the wisdom of the Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions on the understanding of flourishing. In the interim, we'll have several other major lectures and forums. I'll be holding a course next year, all of which are designed to bring us into this deeper conversation. We let a lot of these kind of things slide as law professors, and we let a lot of these things slide in legal education. And I think we have to use this opportunity to kind of summon the wisdom of the humane and social and medical sciences to think much more creatively together about how we can flourish together and how you can flourish as a budding professional here. The idea for this forum came from my colleagues in the Center for the Study of Law and Religion working on the Pursuit of Happiness project directed by Philip Reynolds. We've been working with April Bogle and Linda King and Amy Wheeler and Anita Mann and our center staff, and they have been working to create this forum and the series that will follow. And I think we want to recognize them together with our student assistants, Martha Kim, Grace Kim, and Stacy Harwell, who've done such a fine job in pulling this forum and succeeding forums together. So let's recognize them with a round of applause, please. We have food for mind here. We have food for the body outside. And I think we should move from here to there so that we can feed the other part. Thank you so much for coming.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.